You wake up to the sound of chickens doing their usual early morning screaming contest just outside your window. That is, if you can call a narrow slit carved into a stone wall a window. There's no glass, of course. This is the Middle Ages. Your window is an open invitation to all of nature's finest: cold wind, rain, bugs, your neighbor sneezes, and sometimes small rodents if they're feeling adventurous. Your head throbs with that unmistakable dull pressure behind your eyes. The kind that tells you that your upper molar, the one you've been ignoring for the past, 5 months, is officially protesting its continued involvement in your jaw. You've got yourself a good old medieval toothache. And it is not going away. The room smells like a combination of sheep fat, damp wool, and something that might be last week's turnip stew, still fermenting in the corner. Your mattress is stuffed with straw that hasn't been changed in, ever. It crackles when you move, and if you lie still long enough, it occasionally wriggles. You really don't want to know why. The blanket you're clutching against the morning chill has lice. It also has holes. Whether it's from time, rats, or boredom, no one knows. You sit up, slowly. Not because you're dramatic, but because any sudden movement causes a wave of nausea that makes your stomach do a Renaissance jig. Toothaches in the 14th century aren't just how bad. They're "this might kill me" bad. There's a dark brown streak on the inside of your cheek. That's dried blood. Again. So before you get too cozy, take a second to like the video and subscribe, only if you genuinely enjoy this kind of soothing descent into historical discomfort. And drop a comment letting me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is where you are. It's oddly comforting to know someone out there is trying to fall asleep while I describe pus and pain in excruciating detail. You stumble over to the wooden bowl by the door. It's your sink. There's some water in it. Not fresh. Never fresh. But you swish it in your mouth anyway, because it's that or nothing. The cold makes your tooth throb harder, and you nearly drop the bowl from the sharp, stabbing pain that shoots through your face and up into your eye socket. Now, let's get one thing clear right away. Dentistry, in the medieval world, is not a profession. It's more of a punishment. There are no dental schools. No clean gloves. No fluoride. There is barely even soap. There are, however, many people who will attempt to fix your teeth in exchange for a chicken or possibly the contents of your pocket if you're fancy. But don't get your hopes up. You have options. None of them good. You can visit a barber surgeon who cuts hair, lances boils, amputates limbs, and will gladly yank out your tooth using a rusty pair of iron tongs he last used on a goat. Or you can ask the local wise woman to chant something over your mouth while smearing it with a mysterious poultice made from mold, moss, and mashed up hedgehog bone. And if that fails, you can always pray. Or scream into a pillow until you pass out. Today, you've decided you're desperate enough for the barber surgeon. This is not a decision you've made lightly. You still remember old Bertram, who went to the same guy for a minor abscess and came back missing half his face. But your molar is sending Morse code signals of misery to your entire skull, and the pain is starting to make you hear colors. You wrap a coarse wool shawl around your shoulders and step outside. It's raining. Of course it is. The mud squelches under your feet, soaking through your leather shoes, which are really just stitched animal hides pretending to be footwear. You trudge through the slop of the village, past huts with smoke curling from holes in the roof and children chasing a suspiciously angry chicken. The barber surgeon's hut is exactly what you feared: dark, damp, and filled with the rich aroma of blood, onions, and despair. There's a chair in the center. Not a dentist chair. Just a chair. Wooden. Wobbly. Covered in something that might be hair, or mold, or both. On the table beside it, a collection of tools that look less like medical instruments and more like torture devices: pliers, hooks, a hammer, God help you, and what appears to be a chisel. The barber surgeon greets you with a smile that shows he's clearly immune to his own services. His breath smells like fermented cabbage and ale. His hands are stained brown. With what? Unknown. But definitely not sterilized. You try to explain where the pain is, but halfway through the sentence, he's already reaching for a tool. He grunts in agreement and points to the chair. You sit. It creaks ominously. He picks up a hook and begins poking at your gums, muttering something about hot humors and black bile. Yes, medieval medicine operates under the assumption that your body is filled with invisible fluids that get out of balance if you sin too hard or think too many lusty thoughts. You grip the arms of the chair and close your eyes. He jabs. You yelp. He grins wider. This is going great. Now, for your educational pleasure, let's pause this immersive nightmare to talk a little bit about why this is your life. In medieval Europe, oral hygiene wasn't entirely ignored. People did try to take care of their teeth. But let's be honest, when your daily diet consists of gritty bread, poorly cooked meat, and wine that tastes like regret, you're starting from behind. The average medieval peasant didn't brush their teeth. Not because they didn't want to, but because toothbrushes weren't a thing yet. At least, not for them. Instead, they might chew on twigs. Literally. Chewing sticks made from tree branches like ash, hazel, or even sweet-smelling woods like licorice were used to scrape the gunk off teeth. Think of it as a primitive electric toothbrush, but with no electricity, no bristles, and lots of splinters. They also rinsed their mouths with vinegar or wine. Not exactly Colgate, but acidic enough to kill some bacteria. Of course, vinegar also erodes enamel, so that's a trade-off between smelling like a salad and having teeth. And for toothpaste, they had powders. Lovely powders. Made of crushed herbs, salt, chalk, ashes, and sometimes, when people were feeling especially avant-garde, charcoal. Nothing says clean teeth like rubbing burnt wood across your gums. But let's be real, most people didn't have the time, money, or mental energy for daily dental care. They were too busy not dying from everything else. Tooth decay was just one more item on a long list of things trying to kill you before your 35th birthday. Back in the chair, the barber surgeon makes a sound of success. You feel a sudden, overwhelming pressure. Then a crack. Then a release. The tooth is out. So is part of your gum. You feel something warm running down your chin. Is it blood? Tears? Both? He holds up the tooth like a trophy. It's black, cracked, and looks like something you'd find on a battlefield. You nod, trying not to cry in public. He hands you a rag. You press it to your mouth. It tastes like iron and mildew. Then he offers you a sip of something to numb the pain. It's ale. Bad ale. But you chug it like it's holy water. You stumble out into the street, one tube lighter, several IQ points lower, and filled with a strange sense of relief. The pain is gone, replaced by a throbbing wound and a newfound appreciation for death. On your way home, you pass a neighbor, Agnes, who's boiling something in a cauldron. You ask her what it is. Tooth remedy, she says. Made with vinegar, onions, and dried frog skin. You nod respectfully and keep walking. Tomorrow, maybe you'll try the frog. And just in case you're wondering, yes, people did sometimes die from tooth infections in the Middle Ages. Dental abscesses could lead to sepsis, and with no antibiotics, you were basically one inflamed gum away from meeting your maker. Dentistry wasn't just painful. It was potentially fatal. But that's enough horror for now. Let's rest. You've earned it. You curl up on your lumpy straw mattress, clutching your bloody rag like a teddy bear, and listen to the comforting sounds of someone in the next room violently coughing up what might be their lungs. Sleep well, brave medieval soul. You wake up again. Not because you're well rested. Oh no, far from it. You wake up because someone nearby is loudly vomiting into a wooden bucket. Welcome to medieval communal living. Privacy doesn't exist. Sleep is optional. And the soundtrack to your life is always some variation of wheezing, farting, coughing, or screaming. It's basically a symphony of human suffering with no conductor. You roll over, only to be reminded that your mouth now contains a crater where your tooth used to be. It aches. It throbs. It has a faint metallic tang. You're unsure whether it's healing or preparing for a sequel. You hope it's the former. You also hope no one makes you laugh today, because the left side of your face is currently out of commission. The sun is barely up, peeking through your sad excuse for a window like it regrets having to illuminate this timeline. Outside, it smells like smoke and damp will again. You hear the blacksmith hammering something aggressively, probably venting his own dental trauma. You drag yourself out of bed and immediately step in something squishy. You don't look. You never look. Curiosity did not survive the Middle Ages. You pull your boots on, cracked, damp, and subtly growing a new ecosystem inside, and head out. Today, you're determined to learn how to prevent this dental catastrophe from ever happening again. Maybe, just maybe, there's a smarter way to do this. So, you start asking around. Because that's how information spreads in your village, whispering, guessing, and whoever yells the loudest. You hear rumors, tips, legends, and oh boy, some of them are wild. Let's begin with the most popular one, the worm theory. Yes, the medieval belief that toothaches were caused by tiny worms living in your teeth. Not metaphorical worms, literal ones. You see, some enterprising peasant probably saw a rotting tooth one day, noticed a little fibrous nerve or maggot near it, and thought, ah yes, tooth worms. That checks out. This was so widely believed that people actually wrote about it in medical texts. Learned men, in long robes, scribbling notes like, patient is clearly suffering from worm infestation of the molars. Must burn them out. Burn them out. The treatments based on this theory range from horrifying to please make it stop. One involved taking a hot poker and applying it near the affected tooth, not touching it, just near it, so the worm would be frightened and exit the tooth in a desperate panic. Like a squat tenant being evicted by fire. If that didn't work, the next step was to apply a mix of herbs, garlic, and animal fat to lure the worm out. Because obviously, what worm can resist eau de goat tallow and rotting leek? And then there were the smoking treatments. You'd sit with your mouth over a smoldering mixture of henbane seeds and sulfur, inhaling deeply, like some medieval dental-themed vape session. The smoke, in theory, would asphyxiate the worm. In reality, it would give you a headache, lung damage, and probably a new appreciation for silence. Of course, not everyone believed in worms. Some believed your teeth hurt because of sins. Yes, divine punishment, for lying, lusting, or thinking impure thoughts about your neighbor's daughter while milking your goat. The only remedy for that? Prayer. And maybe confession. But mostly suffering. You could also try magical charms. A popular one involved writing specific Latin words on a piece of parchment and tying it around your neck. Or, if you were really feeling whimsical, placing the parchment in your mouth and biting down. Yes, parchment. Made of sheepskin. Delicious. Another involved spitting in a frog's mouth. Not metaphorically. Literally. You'd catch a frog, hold it firmly, and spit into its mouth while chanting an incantation. This was meant to transfer the pain from you to the frog. Whether it worked or not is unclear. But frogs everywhere probably lived in constant fear. There was also a recipe involving burnt bread and mouse fat. Yes, mouse fat. The bread was scorched, ground into powder, mixed with the rendered fat of a mouse, and applied to the aching tooth. This apparently soothed the gums, or caused nausea. Either way, it distracted you from the actual problem. If none of that appealed to you, you could visit the local apothecary. A mun, or sometimes a very exhausted woman, surrounded by jars of dried plants, animal bits, and questionable liquids. Their shop smelled like mold, lavender, and regret. They might offer you powdered sage, chamomile, or cloves to press into your gums. And honestly, that's not the worst idea. Cloves actually do contain eugenol, a mild anesthetic. So somewhere along the way, someone had a lucky guess. But medieval apothecaries also had a flair for the dramatic. You might be offered a tincture made with urine and lead filings, or a poultice involving mashed eel skins. Why eels? No one knows. Maybe because they're slippery and mysterious, like tooth pain itself. Some apothecaries even suggested oil of vitriol, which is sulfuric acid. A few drops on the tooth would kill the nerve. It would also kill part of your face. But hey, you can't feel pain if you're unconscious. And just in case you were wondering about tooth fillings, no, they did not exist. Not the way we think of them. Some cultures experimented with wax or resin to plug up holes in teeth. But in Europe during the medieval period, if you had a cavity, it stayed a cavity until it became a full-blown abscess, or you solved the problem the good old-fashioned way, with pliers. Dental care was reactive, not preventative. No one talked about plaque. No one talked about flossing. There was no concept of enamel or bacteria or why your tooth was rotting. There was just pain, guesses, and a lot of trial by error involving herbs, animals, and poorly understood science. Now, let's talk about herbal remedies. Because they were everywhere. Sage was chewed to strengthen gums. Mint was used to freshen breath. Because apparently, even in the plague-ridden fog of medieval despair, halitosis was still rude. Myrrh, which sounds exotic and biblical, was used to reduce inflammation. It smelled nice and made you feel like a wise mun, even if you were bleeding out of your face. Willow bark was sometimes used to treat pain because it contained salicin, the precursor to aspirin. Again, blind luck or divine intervention. Hard to say. Horseradish poultices were applied to the jaw to draw out the evil. It mostly drew out your dignity. And then there were the spiritual herbs. Things like St. John's wort, holy thistle, and angelica, so named because someone, somewhere, believed these plants were blessed by celestial forces. You could boil them, chew them, dry them, hang them over your door, or just lie in bed staring at them while crying softly into your wool blanket. Despite all this, the average person didn't live in constant agony. Teeth could be healthy. If you were lucky. If you avoided too much sugar, not hard, since it was basically gold, if you had decent genetics, and if you were too poor to afford fancy foods, you might make it into your 30s with most of your teeth. But when it went wrong, it went very wrong. There are archaeological skulls showing massive abscesses, teeth worn down to the pulp, or jaws permanently warped by infection. And you know what they all had in common? No fillings. No anesthesia. No Novocaine. Just grit, bad luck, and the occasional prayer shouted at a goat. You arrive back home after a long day of oral folklore and despair. Your jaw still aches. Your face is still swollen. But now, at least, you have a deeper appreciation for how much worse it could be. You chew carefully, on the other side of your mouth, obviously, and settle into bed. Outside, the wind howls through the cracks in your wall. You pull your lice-infested blanket closer and whisper a quiet thanks that, for now, you still have most of your teeth. You also quietly resolve never to eat dried figs again. They're the medieval equivalent of chewy candy, and you don't need that kind of danger in your life right now. Now, try to sleep. Let the sound of the village dogs barking at absolutely nothing lull you into a light, paranoid doze. And remember, no matter how bad things get, at least no one's trying to smoke a worm out of your mouth tonight. You wake up. Again. Because that's what we do here, wake up into the continuous nightmare that is medieval dental care. Your jaw is still a little puffy. A reminder of yesterday's herbal experimentation and your ill-fated attempt to gargle with vinegar, salt, and desperation. Outside, the cockerel is screaming like it's paid to annoy you. The smell of pig manure is thick in the air, mingled with the gentle aroma of wet hay and someone boiling cabbage too aggressively. You groggily rub your eyes, stretch, and attempt to yawn. Mistake. Bad idea. Immediate regret. Pain stabs through your mouth like a tiny angry blacksmith is chiseling your molar. You need help. Real help. Not more garlic clove prayers or frog-based curses. Today, you're going to see a dentist. Or something that sort of pretends to be one. But before we travel into the horror show that is medieval dental specialists, just a reminder, if your jaw isn't completely locked in agony yet, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, only if you're genuinely enjoying this beautiful, historically accurate descent into oral hell. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. And if you're falling asleep to this, you're welcome. Hopefully you're not dreaming about tooth extractions. Yet. Back to your miserable day. In the Middle Ages, the word dentist didn't exist. The job of tooth removal fell to people who already had some sort of sharp object and time on their hands. So today's options include a barber, a blacksmith, a monk, or an unlicensed traveling tooth yanko with suspiciously few teeth of his own. You choose the barber surgeon, which sounds kind of official if you squint hard enough. Now, this man, let's call him Hugo, does haircuts, minor surgery, bloodletting, and occasionally removes an arm or boils a wound. He keeps his tools in a stained leather pouch that smells like death and damp leather. There is no sterilization. There is no running water. There is no consent form. Just a stool, a rusty iron toolkit, and a lot of people watching. You see, dental work in this era is a spectator sport. People gather around, especially if it's being done in a public square. You're the afternoon entertainment, sandwiched between a guy playing the lute and a man wrestling a goose. Hugo examines your mouth with the same intensity someone might use to inspect a melon at the market. He smells faintly of meat and dried sweat. He pokes your sore tooth with a dull iron probe. You flinch violently. "Ah," he says, in the smug tone of a man who believes pain equals diagnosis. "It's rotten." "Thanks, Hugo." His solution is simple: rip it out. And so begins your medieval dental extraction, performed without gloves, anesthetic, training, or even basic hygiene. He pulls out a device called a dental pelican, named because it vaguely resembles the beak of the bird. You wish you were joking. The pelican is designed to lever the tooth out of your skull. Slowly, brutally, loudly. You sit on a low stool while Hugo places a leather strap in your hand. You're supposed to bite it to avoid screaming. You don't. You scream anyway. He clamps the pelican to your tooth and begins to twist. You hear it first. A crack. A pop. A squelch. Your mouth fills with a warm, briny taste of blood and regret. People cheer. Someone claps. A child laughs. You are dying inside. Halfway through, the tooth breaks. Oh dear, Hugo mutters, as if he's dropped a spoon and not just fractured your molar into multiple sharp shards now embedded in your jaw. He goes in again, deeper this time, and after several minutes of wrestling your mouth like it owes him money, he yanks out what looks like a very angry piece of ivory. The crowd erupts. One man throws a coin. Someone else offers you a drink. You decline, mostly because swallowing feels like gargling acid. Hugo wipes the tooth on his tunic and offers it back to you. You decline again. He pockets it. You will now forever be a part of his personal dental trophy collection. Now, let's talk about infection. You see, nothing about what just happened was sterile. The pelican? Probably used earlier that day to remove a toe. The rag in his pocket? Covered in old blood and breadcrumbs. Your open gum socket? The perfect portal for every single germ this century has to offer. If you're lucky, your body fights it off with sheer stubbornness. If not, the area swells, reddens, and within a few days, you're clutching your face as pus oozes from your jaw. Fun. If the infection spreads to your bloodstream, congratulations, you now have sepsis, and the odds of surviving without modern antibiotics are somewhere between no and absolutely not. But let's assume for now that you survive. Because you're a stubborn peasant with strong opinions about goats and no sense of self-preservation. Now let's look at the tools used by medieval tooth pullers. The pelican, which we've mentioned. Think of it like pliers made by someone who hates comfort. The dental key, a later invention, shaped like a T. You'd insert it into the mouth, crank it like you're opening a bottle of wine, and hope the tooth comes out instead of your soul. Forceps, which are just glorified tongs. Sometimes, the operator would stand behind you, wrap his arms around your head, and pull backward like he was starting a lawnmower. If none of that worked, chisels and mallets. Yes, hammering a tooth out of your mouth. The phrase dental precision did not exist. Sometimes teeth would be extracted simply because the barber thought they looked suspicious. Overbite? Gone. Tooth growing sideways? Out. Discolored enamel? Clearly cursed, must be exorcised with pliers and a prayer. And aftercare? You're told to rinse with wine or vinegar. Both sting like betrayal. No antibiotics. No gauze. Just a cloth pressed to the wound and instructions to avoid screaming too much. Of course, some people never made it to a professional. Enter the tooth drawers, traveling entertainers who specialized in quick public extractions. They performed in markets and fairs, dressed in flamboyant clothes, shouting through the crowd to lure in customers. These were not healers. These were showmen. The goal wasn't precision. It was speed. They'd yank teeth with flourish, spin them on strings, dance around with bloodied rags, and sometimes offer the extracted tooth to a cheering audience member. It was part horror, part theater, and fully traumatizing. You might get a ribbon, a biscuit, or a pat on the back. You might also get tetanus. But some were clever. They carried bottles of miracle water, a combination of alcohol, herbs, and probably something flammable. They'd pour it on your gums and declare you cured. Temporarily, yes. But also drunk enough to stop crying. And if you were noble or rich, your options were only slightly better. You'd have access to university-trained physicians who spoke Latin, wore fancier robes, and charged ridiculous fees. Their dental care still involved extractions, but they might prescribe opium or soothing syrups and maybe even try to save the tooth. But even then, you weren't safe. Royal skulls unearthed from medieval tombs show abscesses and dental decay just like peasants. Even Queen Elizabeth I, centuries later, was said to have had blackened teeth and bad breath from overindulgence in sugar. Dental rot was the great equalizer. Whether you were a serf or a monarch, your teeth betrayed you in the end. Back in your village, You walk home, bleeding slightly, dazed, and with a new fear of smiling. You try to eat a piece of bread and realize chewing is now a distant memory. Your jaw clicks ominously. You suck on a piece of soft cheese and decide this is your new diet now. You lie down, exhausted, reeling from your close encounter with medieval dentistry. You wrap your head in a cloth, not because it helps, but because it makes you feel marginally more protected from the world. The fire crackles. The village dogs bark. Someone nearby is singing terribly. And you try to sleep, mouth open, one tube lighter, and with a newfound appreciation for modern floss. You wake up. Again. But this time, there's a subtle difference. Your jaw doesn't feel like it's being used as a battleground by two vengeful spirits. So that's progress. Instead, it just sort of throbs, like a heartbeat inside your face. Congratulations, you've survived your first medieval tooth extraction. Statistically improbable, but we love an underdog story. You sit up in your scratchy straw bed, spit into the corner like everyone else, and contemplate the life choices that led you here. Your mouth tastes like rust, wool, and betrayal. It smells worse. You're beginning to wonder, did people back then actually care about cleaning their teeth? Yes. Also no. Because oral hygiene in the Middle Ages was not about pearly whites and minty breath. It was about not dying of a raging mouth infection before age 30. Which, you'll agree, is a pretty reasonable goal. So, did people brush their teeth? Surprisingly, sort of. Toothbrushes as we know them didn't arrive in Europe until the 17th century, but humans have always found creative, sometimes unhinged, ways to scrape the filth off their chompers. In medieval Europe, the options were many and none of them FDA approved, or remotely pleasant. Before we dive in, quick reminder, if your gums haven't fully receded from the stress of this tale yet, consider liking the video and subscribing. Only if you genuinely enjoyed this bizarre walk through ancient oral disaster. Drop a comment with your current time zone and tell me what weird position you're lying in while listening to this. Are you face down like a medieval dental pelican? I need to know. Now, back to your tragically mismanaged mouth. Let's start with toothpicks. Yes, they existed. Common folks often used twigs, bones, or bird feathers to pick bits of barley porridge out of their molars. Nobles carried personal ivory or silver picks. A well-dressed lord might even wear one as jewelry, a tiny spike dangling from a chain, ready to jab at yesterday's mutton between meals. Fashion meets function, baby. Then there were chewing sticks, borrowed from Middle Eastern and African traditions. In fact, these are still used today, miswak and sawak twigs, known for their antibacterial properties. Medieval travelers sometimes brought these back from the Crusades, because if you're going to steal cultural artifacts, you might as well floss. In Europe, locals opted for the random twig from a nearby bush method. Birch was a favorite. You'd chew one end into a frayed brush, then rub it against your teeth like you're sanding down a piece of furniture. Effective? Barely. But the placebo effect was strong. Now let's talk about tooth powders. These were the medieval version of toothpaste, except they were dry, came in pouches, and were usually made by someone who'd also just sold rat tails as medicine. Common ingredients included crushed sage, because mint didn't show up in your toothpaste until centuries later. Salt. Charcoal. Ground oyster shells. Burnt rosemary. Ash from bread crusts. Sometimes, they'd mix in dried herbs or a drop of vinegar to activate the powder. Then you'd rub the gritty mixture onto your teeth using a cloth, a stick, or just your finger. If you're noble, you might use a piece of linen. If you're a peasant, you're using your sleeve and hoping no one notices. How effective was this powder? Well, it did remove plaque, along with half your enamel. It was like using sandpaper to exfoliate your soul. But perhaps the most consistent and oddly sweet source of mouth freshening came from the monastery. Because the monks were clean freaks. No, really. Contrary to the stereotype of dirty, plague-infested medieval folk, monastic orders actually prioritized hygiene. They washed regularly. They combed their hair. And yes, they cleaned their teeth. Why? Well, partly because of religious discipline, and partly because monasteries were giant social bubbles where halitosis could kill the vibe. Some orders required oral rinses every morning. Others had written guides on which herbs to chew for breath and even how to spit discreetly during prayer. They used rinses made from warm water and vinegar, sage-infused wine, myrrh, mint, and honey. They also believed in chewing cloves to freshen the breath. And not just monks, cloves were used by everyone who could afford them. Imported from faraway lands, cloves were expensive and mostly reserved for the elite. You'd tuck one in your cheek like a medieval tic-tac and suck on it during conversations with someone important. You, as a peasant, might chew on parsley. It worked, kind of. But it also screamed, "I just had onions and need to not smell like death." Now for mouth rinses. These varied from household to household, but common ones included vinegar mixed with salt, red wine with crushed herbs, boiled fennel water, water left overnight with crushed charcoal or ash. These rinses did not taste good, but they gave you that "I did something" feeling, which is about as close as you get to actual dental hygiene. Now, you might ask, did people know that not brushing led to cavities? Sort of. They definitely noticed tooth rot and bad breath. Some even connected it with impure humors or hot blood rising to the head. The four humors theory, still going strong, blamed most illnesses on imbalances of blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Apparently, your toothache was just your liver being dramatic again. But some people made observational connections. For example, eating too many sweets, more tooth problems. Not cleaning your mouth, more bad breath. Chewing mint and sage, fewer complaints. So while they didn't know about bacteria, they had vibes, gut feelings, oral astrology. And if all else failed, there was prayer. People genuinely believed toothaches could be caused by spiritual torment. Saint Apollonia was the patron saint of toothache sufferers because she was martyred by having all her teeth ripped out. You were supposed to light a candle and beg her for relief. She probably got tired of the noise. Some folks even made amulets with small bones or herbs tied in cloth, hung around the neck to ease jaw pain. If you were really desperate, you might visit a local cunning woman, a mix of healer and witch, who'd whisper over your head and stick an egg under your pillow. Still better than the barber surgeon, honestly. Now, let's not romanticize things. Despite all their powders and prayers, medieval people had bad teeth. Dental remains from the period show severe wear, exposed nerves, abscesses, and teeth ground flat from a lifetime of chewing tough bread filled with stone-ground grit. And sugar? It wasn't widespread, not yet. It was a luxury, imported from the Middle East and India, and extremely expensive. Only the very rich indulged, and even they used honey more often. So most people didn't rot their teeth from candy, but from coarse food, constant grinding, and complete lack of dental care once problems started. So if your gums were bleeding, you'd shove a cloth in there and keep working. If your breath smelled like a dead crow in summer, you'd chew mint and hope your spouse didn't leave. If your molars cracked from the stone bits in your barley bread, you'd suck on soup and accept your fate. And yet, people cared. They didn't want their mouths to smell like fermented misery. They wanted to keep their teeth, even if they didn't always succeed. There are even records of medieval lovers praising each other's white, even teeth in poetry, so clearly, someone was trying. You lie back, finally understanding the grimy, gritty reality of medieval oral hygiene. Your teeth hurt just thinking about it. But there's a strange peace in knowing people have always tried, against all odds, to clean themselves with herbs, hope, and sand. The fire is low. The night is quiet. And outside, a donkey coughs ominously in the dark. You wake up, again. Your mouth still hurts. Because, and this may surprise you, medieval medicine wasn't exactly known for long-term results. But it's not as bad as yesterday. Now it just feels like someone put a hot pebble in your jaw and told it to vibrate every time you blink. Progress. You roll over onto your flea-ridden, straw-stuffed mattress, wipe a bit of dried something from your lip, blood, drool, divine punishment, and stare at the rafters while pondering life's more pressing question. What if the pain in your tooth isn't from bacteria, but from tiny, screaming demons chewing on your nerves with ghostly spoons? Because that, dear sleeper, is exactly what many medieval people believed. Tooth pain wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a spiritual crisis. An infestation of the soul. And to fix it, you didn't just need a rinse or a rag soaked in wine, you needed magic. Let's begin with one of history's most iconic medieval medical theories, the tooth worm. Yes, you heard that right. A worm. A small, evil, hungry little worm that lived inside your teeth. And no, this wasn't some fringe idea believed only by 3 guys in a swamp and 1 confused goat. The tooth worm theory was widespread, stretching from ancient Babylon across the Middle East, through Rome, and well into medieval Europe. It lasted over 1,000 years, longer than most empires. According to this theory, cavities and toothaches weren't caused by decay or infection. No, they were caused by tiny worms burrowing into your teeth, feeding on your food, and throwing wild parties in your gums. You know, science. These imaginary worms were blamed for everything from mild sensitivity to full-blown abscesses. The proof? Sometimes, when a rotting tooth broke apart, a dentist or barber surgeon might see a bit of stringy pulp or blackened nerve tissue and decide, with the certainty of a man who's never seen a microscope, yes, worms. Case closed. So how did they try to kill these dental demons? That's where the magic comes in. There were entire spells, chants, and amulets dedicated to coaxing, scaring, or straight-up exorcising the worms out of your teeth. This wasn't a one-size-fits-all approach. Oh no. This was a full menu of occult dentistry, curated for your suffering pleasure. Let's walk through a few delightful methods, shall we? The smoke and sulfur ritual. This one is ancient. You take a piece of henbane, a mildly toxic plant, mix it with sulfur, set it on fire, and let the smoke drift into your open, aching mouth. The idea is to smoke out the worm like a tiny squatter in your molars. Picture yourself gagging on burning herbs while praying the demon flea makes a run for it. Did it work? No. But it gave you something else to focus on, like not throwing up. The incantation of Saint Apollonia. We've mentioned her before, patron saint of teeth. Legend says she was tortured by having all her teeth violently extracted. Naturally, that qualifies her as your spiritual hotline when your mouth feels like it's full of tiny anvils. You'd pray to her, burn a candle in her name, or, if desperate, wear a charm etched with her image on your chest. Also common, little lead tokens with Saint Apollonia's name inscribed, tucked under pillows, sewn into clothes, or hung around the neck. You weren't just in pain. You were being haunted. Might as well accessorize for it. The Leech Book of Bald's Magical Remedy. The Anglo-Saxons. Always ready to turn a simple health issue into a stew of horror. This medical text from the 10th century gives us the following lovely cure for toothache. Take the bark of hazel and the root of water agrimony, boil them in wine, and have the patient hold the hot liquid in his mouth. Sure. But wait, then it says, if the pain persists, make a poultice of burnt salt in the brain of a hare, applied directly to the tooth. Let's pause here. The brain of a hare. Because obviously, if your mouth hurts, what you need is rabbit brains slathered across your molars. Medieval logic was basically, let's see what's rotting in the garden and apply it directly to the wound. The toothache charm from Merseburg. From medieval Germany. This magical charm was written in Old High German, and it goes something like, Fall and Woden rode into the forest, and Balder's horse sprained its foot. Bone to bone, blood to blood, joint to joint. So may they be mended. Was this about teeth? No, not even close. But people recited it over aching gums anyway, because, again, if you can't fix it with knowledge, just rhyme at it and hope it gives up. Toothache pills made of dirt and blood. This one comes to us from folk traditions in Eastern Europe and parts of rural France. The recipe? Mix clay, dried herbs, a drop of your own blood, collected via sharpstick, and occasionally, hair from a black cat. Form into a tiny pellet, stick it in your mouth, and whisper the name of the last person who wronged you. If you're lucky, the pain fades. If you're unlucky, your neighbor thinks you're a witch, and you get burned at the stake. Either way, the tooth stops hurting eventually. Now let's talk about the tooth fairy, or more accurately, her older, grittier cousin, the tooth witch. Because in many medieval cultures, losing a tooth was a spiritually dangerous event. A discarded tooth could be used in sorcery, or it might attract demons. In some areas, it was believed that if a witch got hold of your lost tooth, she could use it to control you. So naturally, people developed very specific rituals for disposing of their teeth. Bury it under a tree. Throw it over the roof and say a rhyme. Burn it and scatter the ashes in a stream. Feed it to a dog. This one was shockingly popular. One English folk rhyme went, "Mouse, mouse, take my tooth, and give me one that's strong and smooth." In Norse tradition, there were tannfæ or tooth fee gifts, coins or trinkets given when a child lost their first tooth. The roots of the tooth fairy, sure. But instead of glitter and wings, you get a vaguely threatening house sprite and a copper penny. Even adults treated tooth loss with superstition. If your tooth fell out during a full moon, you were cursed for the season. If it broke during a wedding, it meant your spouse would die young. And if it shattered in church, well, that probably just meant God hated your oral hygiene. There are also records of tooth amulets made from animals, bear teeth, dog teeth, even shark teeth, worn as protective charms against toothache. Ironically, they probably work better than the poultices and bloodletting. Because if nothing else, they kept the neighborhood barber surgeon at a distance. And speaking of sorcerers, let's not forget the charming trend of blaming tooth pain on witches. If your molars started pulsing and you hadn't eaten anything suspicious lately, it might mean someone put a hex on you. This was especially dangerous if you were rich, because nothing says easy scapegoat like a poor woman who looks at you funny while holding herbs. So, you'd go to a cunning moan or local healer. He'd wave a stick around, mumble something in broken Latin, maybe pour goat's milk over your feet. And if the pain still didn't stop, well, guess it's time to burn the neighbor. Medieval medicine was 20% guesswork, 30% spiritual anxiety, and 50% who can we blame for this? You lie back in your creaky bed, half convinced there's a worm in your molars and a curse in your soup. But somehow, all this magic, the prayers, the herbs, the amulets, it wasn't just superstition. It was hope. Strange, desperate, spicy-smelling hope. Because when your only options are get your tooth yanked out with a rusty spoon, or sing to the moon while burning sage, you pick the one that doesn't leave you bleeding on the floor. Even if it involves rabbit brains. You shift slightly, tucking the blanket under your chin. Your jaw still aches. But now, at least, you know why. And as the fire crackles and the distant howl of a wolf reminds you that wolves also have teeth and probably better dental care, you drift off. You wake up again. Your mouth still hurts. Because, and this may surprise you, medieval medicine wasn't exactly known for long-term results. But it's not as bad as yesterday. Now it just feels like someone put a hot pebble in your jaw and told it to vibrate every time you blink. Progress. You roll over onto your flea-ridden, straw-stuffed mattress. Wipe a bit of dried something from your lip, blood, drool, divine punishment, and stare at the rafters while pondering life's more pressing question. What if the pain in your tooth isn't from bacteria, but from tiny, screaming demons chewing on your nerves with ghostly spoons? Because that, dear sleeper, is exactly what many medieval people believed. Tooth pain wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a spiritual crisis. An infestation of the soul. And to fix it, you didn't just need a rinse or a rag soaked in wine, you needed magic. Let's begin with one of history's most iconic medieval medical theories, the tooth worm. Yes, you heard that right. A worm. A small, evil, hungry little worm that lived inside your teeth. And no, this wasn't some fringe idea believed only by 3 guys in a swamp and 1 confused goat. The tooth worm theory was widespread, stretching from ancient Babylon across the Middle East, through Rome, and well into medieval Europe. It lasted over 1,000 years, longer than most empires. According to this theory, cavities and toothaches weren't caused by decay or infection. No, they were caused by tiny worms burrowing into your teeth, feeding on your food, and throwing wild parties in your gums. You know, science. These imaginary worms were blamed for everything from mild sensitivity to full-blown abscesses. The proof? Sometimes, when a rotting tooth broke apart, a dentist or barber surgeon might see a bit of stringy pulp or blackened nerve tissue, and decide, with the certainty of a man who's never seen a microscope, yes, worms. Case closed. So how did they try to kill these dental demons? That's where the magic comes in. There were entire spells, chants, and amulets dedicated to coaxing, scaring, or straight-up exorcising the worms out of your teeth. This wasn't a one-size-fits-all approach. Oh no. This was a full menu of occult dentistry, curated for your suffering pleasure. Let's walk through a few delightful methods, shall we? The smoke and sulfur ritual. This one is ancient. You take a piece of henbane, a mildly toxic plant, mix it with sulfur, set it on fire, and let the smoke drift into your open, aching mouth. The idea is to smoke out the worm like a tiny squatter in your molars. Picture yourself gagging on burning herbs while praying the demon flea makes a run for it. Did it work? No. But it gave you something else to focus on, like not throwing up. The incantation of Saint Apollonia. We've mentioned her before, patron saint of teeth. Legend says she was tortured by having all her teeth violently extracted. Naturally, that qualifies her as your spiritual hotline when your mouth feels like it's full of tiny anvils. You'd pray to her, burn a candle in her name, or, if desperate, wear a charm etched with her image on your chest. Also common, little lead tokens with Saint Apollonia's name inscribed, tucked under pillows, sewn into clothes, or hung around the neck. You weren't just in pain. You were being haunted. Might as well accessorize for it. The Leech Book of Bald's Magical Remedy. The Anglo-Saxons. Always ready to turn a simple health issue into a stew of horror. This medical text from the 10th century gives us the following lovely cure for toothache. Take the bark of hazel and the root of water agrimony, boil them in wine, and have the patient hold the hot liquid in his mouth. Sure. But wait, then it says, if the pain persists, make a poultice of burnt salt and the brain of a hare, applied directly to the tooth. Let's pause here. The brain of a hare. Because obviously, if your mouth hurts, what you need is rabbit brain slathered across your molars. Medieval logic was basically, let's see what's rotting in the garden and apply it directly to the wound. The toothache charm from Merseburg. From medieval Germany, this magical charm was written in Old High German, and it goes something like, Fall and Woden rode into the forest, and Balder's horse sprained its foot. Bone to bone, blood to blood, joint to joint. So may they be mended. Was this about teeth? No, not even close. But people recited it over aching gums anyway, because, again, if you can't fix it with knowledge, just rhyme at it and hope it gives up. Toothache pills made of dirt and blood. This one comes to us from folk traditions in Eastern Europe and parts of rural France. The recipe? Mix clay, dried herbs, a drop of your own blood, collected by a sharp stick, and occasionally, hair from a black cat. Form into a tiny pellet. Stick it in your mouth and whisper the name of the last person who wronged you. If you're lucky, the pain fades. If you're unlucky, your neighbor thinks you're a witch and you get burned at the stake. Either way, the tooth stops hurting eventually. Now let's talk about the tooth fairy, or more accurately, her older, grittier cousin, the tooth witch. Because in many medieval cultures, losing a tooth was a spiritually dangerous event. A discarded tooth could be used in sorcery, or it might attract demons. In some areas, it was believed that if a witch got hold of your lost tooth, she could use it to control you. So naturally, people developed very specific rituals for disposing of their teeth. Bury it under a tree. Throw it over the roof and say a rhyme. Burn it and scatter the ashes in a stream. Feed it to a dog. This one was shockingly popular. One English folk rhyme went, Mouse, mouse, take my tooth, and give me one that's strong and smooth. In Norse tradition, there were tannfæ, or tooth fee gifts, coins or trinkets given when a child lost their first tooth. The roots of the tooth fairy, sure. But instead of glitter and wings, you get a vaguely threatening house sprite and a copper penny. Even adults treated tooth loss with superstition. If your tooth fell out during a full moon, you were cursed for the season. If it broke during a wedding, it meant your spouse would die young. And if it shattered in church, well, that probably just meant God hated your oral hygiene. There are also records of tooth amulets made from animals, bear teeth, dog teeth, even shark teeth, worn as protective charms against toothache. Ironically, they probably work better than the poultices and bloodletting. Because if nothing else, they kept the neighborhood barber surgeon at a distance. And speaking of sorcerers, let's not forget the charming trend of blaming tooth pain on witches. If your molars started pulsing and you hadn't eaten anything suspicious lately, it might mean someone put a hex on you. This was especially dangerous if you were rich, because nothing says easy scapegoat like a poor woman who looks at you funny while holding herbs. So, you'd go to a cunning moan or local healer. He'd wave a stick around, mumble something in broken Latin, maybe pour goat's milk over your feet. And if the pain still didn't stop, well, guess it's time to burn the neighbor. Medieval medicine was 20% guesswork, 30% spiritual anxiety, and 50% who can we blame for this? You lie back in your creaky bed, half convinced there's a worm in your molars and a curse in your soup. But somehow, all this magic, the prayers, the herbs, the amulets, it wasn't just superstition. It was hope. Strange, desperate, spicy-smelling hope. Because when your only options are get your tooth yanked out with a rusty spoon or sink to the moon while burning sage, you pick the one that doesn't leave you bleeding on the floor. Even if it involves rabbit brains. You shift slightly, tucking the blanket under your chin. Your jaw still aches. But now, at least, you know why. And as the fire crackles and the distant howl of a wolf reminds you that wolves also have teeth and probably better dental care, you drift off. You wake up again. But this time, something feels different. Not better, mind you, just different. You instinctively press your tongue to the place where your tooth used to be, the one they yanked out with tongs that probably also served double duty in the forge, and instead of the usual fleshy gap, you feel something hard, smooth, slightly metallic. Congratulations. You've entered the world of medieval tooth repair. That's right. In a world where people regularly believed in demon worms, burned hurt for luck, and solved abscesses with wine-soaked breadcrumbs, some souls were bold enough to look at a mouthful of rot and say, "You know what this needs? More stuff in it." Now, modern you might think of dental implants, porcelain veneers, and precision drills that whine like anxious bees. But medieval you're about to get introduced to fake teeth made from dead people, animal bones, and gold wire. All the makings of a smile that says, "Yes, I'm technically alive." Let's begin with the obvious question. Why would anyone in the Middle Ages try to repair a tooth at all? Most people didn't. Most people accepted that their teeth would fall out one by one, like stone columns in a cursed cathedral, until they were left gumming barley porridge and hissing at strangers. But if you were wealthy, vain, or influential, say, a noble with a banquet to host, or a merchant who needed to look mildly human, you might be willing to pay to keep your face intact. And thus was born the noble, horrifying profession of tooth replacement. Let's walk through your options, shall we? Option 1, animal teeth. You're rich enough to want new teeth, but not rich enough to get human ones. So your barber surgeon, who also, let's remember, cuts hair, sets bones, and possibly neuters sheep, offers to give you a pig's tooth. Or maybe a cow's. Dogs if you're in a hurry. They're filed down, vaguely shaped into something that looks sort of molarish if you squint, and jammed into the space where your real tooth used to live. Sometimes they're held in place with wax. Sometimes they're literally just shoved into the gum and hope to take root. Spoiler, they never take root. And because there's no real sanitation, you now have a foreign animal corpse fragment slowly decaying inside your mouth. On the plus side, you can now snort like a pig at dinner and be anatomically consistent. Option 2, human teeth. Ah yes, the premium model. This was more common in places like Renaissance Italy and 14th century France, where vanity and rot lived side by side like church and state. Wealthy elites wanted real human teeth to maintain their smiles, preferably from younger donors, because of course youth was more appealing even in corpse form. But where, you ask, did they get these teeth? Well, sometimes from executed criminals, fresh supply, especially after hangings. Sometimes from corpses dug up in secret. And sometimes, brace yourself, from desperate poor people who sold their own teeth to survive. This was especially common during famines or plagues, when a hungry peasant might walk into town, remove a molar with a rock and a prayer, and trade it for enough bread to not die. You, dear listener, might be carrying a beggar's bicuspid or a convict's canine. Congratulations, your mouth is a medieval real estate development built on morally questionable land. And these weren't just stuck in randomly. Oh no. Let's talk about gold wire. Once the replacement tooth, human or pig or otherwise, was selected, the next step was installation. And since medieval people hadn't quite figured out screws or adhesives or, anesthetic, they used what they did have. Wire. Usually gold. Sometimes silver. Occasionally thread made from animal sinew. The new tooth was tied to the neighboring teeth, looped in like it was a tent peg, using this gold wire. If your adjacent teeth were too rotten to hold the wire, well, time to yank them too and start again. The result? A a glittering, barely functional dental nightmare that looked fine at a distance, but up close resembled something built during an earthquake by someone wearing mittens. Now imagine eating with this mouth. Anything hard would dislodge the fake tooth. Anything sticky would pull the whole system sideways. There are records of people swallowing their own replacement teeth mid-feast and then trying to retrieve them later. Let's just say flossing was not yet invented. But wait, it gets better. Some medieval dentists believed you could just hammer teeth back into place. Literally take a dislodged or wobbly tooth, grab a blunt instrument, and tap it back into the socket. This practice, creatively known as reimplantation, was about as effective as it sounds. Sometimes the tooth stayed. Sometimes the jaw cracked. Sometimes the entire front row of teeth collapsed like a game of dental Jenga. And you know what happened if it didn't work? They tried it again. Because if at first you don't succeed, beat your face with a mallet and hope for divine intervention. Dentures also existed, and if that sentence surprises you, brace yourself. Primitive dentures go back to ancient times, but by the late Middle Ages, you could find full or partial sets made from carved ivory, cow bone, or dead people's teeth arranged artfully into wooden frames. They were held in place by being tied to the gums, worn like a reversed muzzle. Not comfortable. Not secure. But hey, if you were rich and desperate to chew semi-solid food at a banquet without looking like a skeleton trying to seduce a ham, they were your best option. Dentures were especially popular among aging aristocrats who still wanted to smile, laugh, and conspire, but whose natural teeth had long since abandoned chic. There's even evidence that some nobles used pitch or tree sap to glue them in. You can imagine how delicious that tasted by the third course. Now, let's take a little detour and visit medieval Japan, where dentistry was equally horrifying but in completely different ways. There, some tooth replacements involved shark teeth polished and inserted as status symbols. Yes, status. Because having non-human parts in your mouth wasn't shameful, it was badass. Imagine showing up to court with a bite radius of a small apex predator. You might not be able to smile without cutting your own lips, but at least nobody would question your authority. Back in Europe, of course, this trend didn't catch on. Too subtle. Also, most Europeans were terrified of the sea. Instead, wealthy Europeans stuck to ivory teeth, made from walrus tusk or elephant ivory. Beautiful, strong, slightly off-white, and slowly rotting. Because ivory is organic, and once it's sitting in your warm, wet mouth full of bacteria, it starts to go bad. Which means after 6 months, your glorious new fake smile smelled like a goat's armpit and tasted like regret. But did they stop? Of course not. If your teeth fell out, you replaced them. If the replacements fell out, you got new ones. If those failed, you hired a portrait artist to paint you smiling while you sulked in the corner sipping broth through a cloth napkin. Because medieval life was about appearances, not comfort. Smiling in public was rare anyway, not because people were gloomy, but because everyone's mouth was a dental Chernobyl and they preferred to keep the horror contained. So, where does that leave you? You lie in bed, with a molar held in place by what feels like gold fishing wire. It itches. It throbs. It probably wasn't cleaned before installation. There's a 30% chance you swallowed a bug earlier and a 90% chance that tooth used to belong to someone who died of something tragic. But you're technically repaired. Sort of. At least until breakfast. You roll over, adjust a blanket, and listen to the night sounds of your medieval neighborhood. Owls hooting, pigs snorting, someone coughing their soul out in the next room. And you smile. Just a little. Carefully. So your fake tooth doesn't fall out and stab your tongue. Because somehow, even after grave robbing and gold wire, medieval dentistry still counts as trying their best. You wake up again. Which is frankly surprising. Your mouth feels like a rat crawled in during the night and built a nest between your molars. Everything's dry, your tongue is a carpet of old regrets, and you're pretty sure your breath could legally qualify as a biohazard. Welcome to another glorious day in the medieval world, where oral hygiene wasn't so much a routine as it was a vague suggestion, and mini fresh meant someone probably stuffed an herb in your mouth because they thought you were dying. Let's talk about mouthwash. Now, today you've got aisles of sparkly blue liquids that promise to kill 99.9% of bacteria, leave your breath feeling like peppermint clouds, and possibly reverse the Great Depression. But back in the Middle Ages, mouthwash wasn't bought, It was brewed, and the main goal wasn't so much to kill bacteria as it was to overwhelm them with noise. A typical medieval mouthwash recipe looked like something you'd find in a witch's trash bin. Boil wine, yes, wine, because water was for peasants and dysentery. Add cinnamon, cloves, or mint leaves. Mix with a splash of vinegar. And top it off with ashes or brine. Because nothing says fresh breath like a tongue soaked in salty smoke and alcohol. The wealthy might even rinse with rosewater, because if your teeth were falling out, at least they could smell like an overpriced funeral. So before we go any further, go ahead and take a moment to like this video and subscribe, only if you're actually enjoying this slow, sarcastic descent into oral misery. And leave a comment with the time and place you're tuning in from. It's always weirdly comforting to know someone in Reykjavik is drifting off to descriptions of plague-era toothpaste at 3 a.m. Now, where were we? Yes, breath. Or more specifically, how much it reeked. Halitosis, that's a clinical term for breath that smells like you ate a skunk and then made out with a corpse, was a known issue in medieval society. They didn't call it halitosis, of course. They had more poetic terms. Things like foul vapors, odorous humors, the devil's whisper from within. And if that doesn't paint a lovely picture of morning breath in 1347, nothing will. Now, let's clarify something important. People did try to clean their mouths. The idea that medieval peasants just sat around letting their teeth rot while eating mud pies is a little unfair. They just didn't know why things rotted, or what germs were, or that scrubbing with brick dust was, scientifically speaking, counterproductive. Here's what a standard medieval oral hygiene routine might look like. Wake up. Spit. Rub your teeth and gums with a rag dipped in vinegar or wine. If you are fancy, chew on parsley, anise, or fennel seeds to freshen breath. If you were a monk, maybe gnaw on licorice root, which was believed to calm the stomach and the soul. Rinse with vinegar, salt water, or a mixture of sage and myrrh. Yes, myrrh. The same stuff gifted to baby Jesus. Because when your gums are receding and your breath smells like an open grave, what you really need is a little holiday cheer. Now, if you were poor, you still might chew herbs, mostly because they were growing in the yard and didn't cost anything. Parsley, mint, or even wild thyme were commonly chewed not just for breath, but because people believed they had cooling properties, which sounds nice until you realize cooling usually meant makes your mouth numb enough to ignore the pain. Let's talk about tooth powders, too. Medieval Europe had plenty of them. They weren't called toothpaste because paste requires consistency, and nothing in this era is consistent, especially not texture. Tooth powders were usually homemade concoctions of crushed burnt eggshells, ground charcoal, salt, herbs like mint or sage, occasionally ground up bones or bricks. Mix it all together, rub it on a damp cloth or chew stick, and scrub until you either feel clean or pass out from gum bleeding. Bonus points if your powder tasted like regret. But hey, at least it was an effort. And yes, chew sticks. Toothbrushes, as we think of them today, didn't appear in Europe until around the 17th century. But chew sticks, basically small twigs with one frayed end, were used widely. You'd chew one end to make a soft brush, then use it to scrub your teeth and gums. If you were really fashionable, you might even dip it in rose water or clove oil first. You could also use a cloth wrapped around your finger, soaked in salt or vinegar, to manually rub each tooth. Efficient, portable, horribly abrasive, but it gets better. Let's talk about breath perfume. Yes, that was a thing. In elite circles, especially among nobility and courtiers, bad breath was a social weapon. It could ruin reputations, destroy marriages, end entire dinner parties. So people turned to breath perfumes, little sachets of herbs or aromatic beads that you could suck on, chew, or hang near your neck. Some were worn on necklaces or tucked into the sleeves, so that when you spoke, you could subtly waft the scent forward, as if saying, "Yes, I am talking to you, but you're really smelling lavender and cloves. You're welcome." Some nobles went even further and rinsed their mouths with mixtures of honey, spice, and wine, not for cleaning, but purely to coat the inside of their mouths with a seductive aroma. Imagine whispering state secrets into someone's ear while your breath smells like medieval mead mulled with cinnamon. Now imagine doing the same after eating pickled fish, onions, and ale, without a rinse, because that was also common, which is why smell-based insults were a huge thing in this era. Medieval people didn't hold back. They had entire poems and songs written about people who smelled like dead animals or had breath fit to melt iron. There are even records of lawsuits where people were denied entry to court because of their body odor, including oral stench. Let's also not forget the religious angle. Some monks believed bad breath was a sign of sinful living. Because obviously, if you're chewing meat on Friday and lusting after the brewer's daughter, your soul's gonna rot, and your teeth just follow along. This belief led to a fascinating bit of medieval guilt dentistry, where people would confess to lustful dreams or gluttony and be told to rinse their mouths with vinegar or chew bitter herbs, literally trying to purge the sin from their breath. Speaking of bitter things, let's talk about wormwood. Yes, the plant famously used in absinthe. It was also chewed or brewed into rinse by medieval folk who wanted to freshen their mouths, despite its taste being somewhere between death and pine-flavored soap. But hey, it killed bacteria. Possibly your tongue as well. Small price. And then there's the ultimate flex, having white teeth. Not clean. Not healthy. Just white. To achieve this, medieval fashionistas would rub their teeth with burnt bread, chalk, or even pumice stone. Because yes, in the absence of fluoride, they tried sandpapering their way to beauty. Did it work? Sometimes. For a week. Then the enamel wore off, the teeth cracked, and they fell out. But until then, you looked fantastic while quietly bleeding from the gums. Let's drift now to the Islamic world, which had vastly superior dental hygiene during this time. In the Islamic Golden Age, scholars like Al-Zarawi and Avicenna wrote medical texts detailing oral health practices, from proper tooth cleaning using miswak sticks made from the Salvadora persica tree, to understanding the link between tooth decay and diet. Miswak wasn't just popular, it was endorsed by the Prophet Muhammad himself and used widely for cleaning teeth before prayers. It's naturally antibacterial, tastes herbal, and doesn't require toothpaste. It was basically a medieval power tool with better branding. So while Europe was rubbing ashes on its teeth and whispering about sin, the Islamic world was out here flossing with purpose. Finally, we circle back to you. It's morning. You splash some vinegar in your mouth, swish it around until your eyes water, then spit it into the fire because, yes, that's where all things go eventually. You rub your teeth with a cloth. You chew on some mint. You try not to think about the rat that ran across your pillow at dawn. And you breathe out, hoping, just hoping, that today your mouth doesn't smell like betrayal. Because in the medieval world, survival isn't just about food or shelter. It's about convincing others to stand close enough to hear your pleas for more soup. You wake up with a headache. That's normal. You went to bed with one too, but now it's different. It's centered behind your jaw. You poke at your cheek. Something throbs. Something pulses. Something deep inside your mouth is trying to escape. And congratulations, you have a toothache. In the medieval world. Which means you now face the most terrifying crossroad of your life. You can live with it, or you can seek help. And by help, I mean a man with questionable facial hair, a cart full of rusty hooks, and a business card that says surgeon, barber, and purveyor of good news. He'll be pulling into the town square any minute now, shouting something like, "Tooth pain? Gums possessed by demons? Step right up. The doctor of dental mysteries is here. Free entertainment with every extraction." And here you are, holding your cheek, feeling the pressure building, trying to decide if you'd rather risk death, or worse, medieval anesthesia. Spoiler, there is none. Welcome to the traveling freak show of medieval dentistry. Let's take a soothing stroll through the horrors. Because the truth is, there were no real dentists back then. Not in the modern sense. There were barber surgeons, traveling tooth pullers, street charlatans, and the occasional monastic healer who thought you could cleanse a cavity with prayer and beet juice. If you lived in a major city, maybe you could find someone with a little surgical experience. But if you lived in a village or anywhere remotely rural, your options were the village blacksmith, who owns pliers, the butcher's apprentice, who is good with bones, your grandmother, who's seen everything, or, most famously, the traveling tooth puller. Now, these guys were the rock stars of medieval oral pain. They rolled into town with colorful banners, wooden carts, and crowds of terrified peasants. They often had assistants dressed like jesters, loud music playing, and sometimes even a dancing bear, because nothing says qualified dental care like a juggling bear named Oswald. And what were their tools? Well, Imagine your kitchen drawer a shame. Now make it worse. Rusty pliers, iron tongs, broken awls, curved blades, and hooks that looked like they were forged in a nightmare. There were no gloves, no sterilization, no understanding of infection. Just sheer, blind faith in brute strength and speed. The good ones could pull a tooth in under 10 seconds. The bad ones needed encouragement. And by encouragement, we mean 3 assistants to hold you down, a leather strap to bite on, and maybe a song to distract from the fact that you were about to be defanged by a man who also trimmed hair and castrated cheek. But before we go further into the extraction symphony, let's pause here while your imaginary gums still ache in empathy, and say, like this video and subscribe if you're enjoying this delightful descent into oral chaos. And let me know in the comments what time it is and where you're watching from. I promise not to send a tooth puller to your village unless you specifically request one. Alright, let's talk tooth pulling contests. Yes, those existed. Especially during religious festivals or markets. Tooth pulling was not just a service, it was entertainment. Performers would set up stages and challenge each other to pull the most teeth, the fastest, or from the most uncooperative mouths, which usually meant drunk men shouting obscenities while foaming at the mouth. Crowds would gather. Bets were placed. Sometimes music played. And when a particularly stubborn molar finally came loose, the crowd would cheer like a knight had slain a dragon. If a woman screamed during the process, bonus applause. If someone passed out from blood loss, standing ovation. And the blood. Oh, the blood. Imagine someone yanking out your molar with metal tongs, twisting back and forth like they're unscrewing a jar of expired jam, while people laugh and point and someone sells sausages next to the stage. No antiseptic. No gauze. Just spit, prayer, and hope. If you were lucky, the bleeding stopped within the hour. If not, you were either rushed to the local apothecary for a poultice made of cobwebs and mold, or you died quietly in your sleep from a tooth abscess that reached your brain. Let's not forget the tooth key. Sounds charming, right? Like something a fairy would use to unlock your molars? Wrong. The tooth key was a metal device shaped like a key with a horrifying twist. Instead of unlocking anything, it clamped around the tooth, then used a crank and twist motion to violently wrench it out of your skull. If the root snapped, well, they'd just try again, from a different angle, while humming a folk tune. Many of these pullers had no real training. They weren't required to. Some were former blacksmiths. Some were actors. Some were just very enthusiastic. The only requirement was confidence, a loud voice, and the ability to disappear when things went wrong, which they often did. Imagine infection, broken jaws, nerve damage, multiple teeth pulled by accident. There are documented cases of entire jaws being shattered because someone misjudged the angle or slipped mid-pull. Now, let's add a touch of theatricality. Many of these tooth pullers would perform with mock assistants who pretended to be patients. These shills would climb on stage, pretend to be terrified, sit down, and have a fake tooth yanked or a loose one prearranged for easy removal. They'd scream, fall down, then stand up laughing and show the crowd that it didn't hurt at all. It was medieval PR tooth pulling as propaganda. And it worked. People lined up in droves. Especially because it was free. Most pullers didn't charge. They made money from tips or by selling the extracted teeth to tooth dealers, who in turn sold them to dentures makers for the rich. Yes, false teeth existed, and we'll get to those horror stories in another chapter. Let's talk briefly about tooth fairs. These were events, mostly in France and Germany, where dozens of tooth pullers would gather in public squares and compete for customers. There were banners, contests, bribes, shouting matches, and occasionally actual fights. Imagine a farmer's market, but instead of carrots and cheese, you're buying trauma and tetanus. And of course, the religious side. Many believed toothaches were caused by sin, demonic possession, or imbalanced humors. So in some villages, rather than go to the puller, people would visit holy shrines, hoping a relic could heal their pain. In England, there were reports of people making pilgrimages to touch the teeth of Saint Apollonia, the patron saint of dentistry, who, ironically, had her teeth smashed out during martyrdom. People prayed to her for relief, or better aim for their local tooth puller. And let's not forget the toothworms. Yes, we've talked about them, but here they make another appearance. Some tooth pullers carried models of toothworms made of wax or string and claimed to remove them during extractions. They'd show them to the crowd like trophies, yelling, "Behold, the beast that plagued this poor man's tooth." People believed it, because when pain leaves the body and something gross is shown in its place, the medieval mind finds peace. But not all charlatans pulled teeth. Some claimed to cure pain without removal, offering herbal salves, magic powders, or prayers whispered into a stone, which you were supposed to bite down on during full moons. One popular trick was to sell elixirs that numbed the gums. Most were just cheap wine, vinegar, and opium. Sometimes urine. And when they didn't work, well, that's when the hook came out. Let's rewind now, gently, to you. You're sitting on a wooden stool. The puller is hovering above you with a grin, holding a tooth key. A jester is juggling potatoes nearby. Children are watching, their faces sticky with honey. You're about to become the main attraction. He steadies your jaw. He tells you it won't hurt. You feel the metal clamp, the twist, the yank. And then, blinding, beautiful pain. Something pops. Something tears. Something flees your mouth like it's being exorcised. And when the ringing stops, you taste iron, and vinegar, and relief. The crowd cheers. You're handed your tooth in a dirty handkerchief. And you walk home, bleeding, dizzy, triumphant. Because you've survived. Tomorrow, you'll have a fever. By Friday, you might have sepsis. But today, you're whole. You wake up missing something. Not emotionally. Not spiritually. No, this time, it's physical. A gaping void in your mouth. A front tooth, or three. Maybe they were knocked out in a drunken brawl over soup temperature. Maybe they were yanked out by the neighborhood barber surgeon/puppeteer. Or maybe they just gave up and fell out after months of chronic decay, acidic mead, and zero oral hygiene. Either way, you look in a puddle and realize you are now ugly by medieval standards. Which is saying a lot. Because this is an era where lice are considered accessories and no one knows what a toothbrush is. You try to smile. You resemble a haunted jack-o'-lantern. Children avoid you. Dogs bark. A monk won't make eye contact. And that, dear listener, means it's time for false teeth. Yes, even in the putrid, disease-slick halls of the Middle Ages, humans were already dabbling in the Frankenstein art of dental restoration. Or, more accurately, tooth cosplay. But don't expect anything sleek or white. These weren't veneers. These were dental horror shows, glued together with hope, string, and an alarming amount of dead people. Let's take a deep breath, hopefully not through your mouth, and begin our descent into the soot-covered dungeon of medieval dentures. Now, you might assume people back then didn't care about appearances. That they simply gummed their way through life, whistling through toothless grins, chewing barley mush until the end. And while that's mostly true, there were exceptions, especially among the wealthy, the vain, and the terminally dramatic. For some, missing teeth meant social embarrassment, especially if you were rich enough to afford shame. Nobles, merchants, clergy, they needed their smiles intact, if only to judge others in style. Because nothing says moral superiority like a full row of teeth you didn't grow yourself. So what did these early false teeth look like? Well, imagine a haunted doll's mouth stitched together by a blind taxidermist. Now make it smell worse. Some dentures were made from animal teeth, often from dogs, cows, or even pigs. These were sometimes filed down and shaped to vaguely resemble human incisors. Other sets used real human teeth, pulled from the corpses of the recently deceased or from living poor people desperate enough to sell a bicuspid for a pint of ale. Yes, tooth trafficking. It's older than the feudal system. Fun historical tidbit. In later centuries, especially during and after the Napoleonic Wars, it was common for battlefield scavengers to collect the teeth of fallen soldiers to make what were delicately called Waterloo teeth. Basically, some nobleman somewhere was smiling with molars that had once belonged to a French infantryman who died screaming in a muddy ditch. Sweet dreams. But back in the medieval period, these corpse chompers weren't exactly subtle. They were strung together with wire, linen threads, metal fasteners, or sometimes tiny carved wooden bases. Think of it like dental macaroni art. If macaroni were made of someone else's jaw, fitting these monstrosities into your mouth was an experience in itself. They didn't sit naturally. They didn't bite properly. And they weren't exactly custom-fitted. The process went something like this. Step 1, shove it in. Step 2, tie it to your remaining teeth. Step 3, cry softly and pretend everything's fine. Now, before we go further into the tragic carnival of false teeth, take a second, breathe through your nose, hopefully with some dignity. And if you're enjoying this disturbing journey, give this video a like. Tap subscribe if you want more dry historical suffering to fall asleep to. And tell me in the comments what time it is and where you're watching from. I won't judge you unless you're chewing beef jerky while listening to this. Let's return now to materials. Teeth weren't the only components used in these early dentures. Sometimes people got creative. Pieces of ivory were carved into tooth shapes, usually from hippopotamus, walrus, or elephant tusks. That might sound fancy, but ivory wears down over time. And in the warm, bacteria-filled swamp that is the human mouth, it rots. Yes, your $800 carved elephant incisor eventually turns gray, cracks, and starts to smell like damp upholstery. Also, ivory absorbs flavor. So if you chew garlic or onion stew, which is every meal in medieval Europe, your teeth soon reek like an alchemist's fart. Wood was another favorite. It wasn't durable. It wasn't clean. But it was easy to carve. Japanese dental traditions in later centuries would refine this into an art form. But in Europe, they just jammed wood in your gums and hoped it didn't splinter. Some false teeth were painted white with chalk, lime, or even powdered bone, which made them look more realistic until the paint flaked off and you were left with something resembling the jaw of a deceased goat. To keep them in place, early dentures often used springs or hinges that clamped the upper and lower plates together. These were primitive, clunky, and about as comfortable as chewing on a mousetrap. You had to use your facial muscles just to keep your fake teeth from springing out mid-meal and landing in your neighbor's bowl. That happened. Often. There are stories, probably exaggerated, but we hope not, of false teeth flying across banquet halls, landing in soup, or being picked up and used as conversation starters. Imagine explaining that the thing floating in your porridge once belonged to your cousin, who died of dysentery. But hey, it gets worse. Let's talk about the glue. If you didn't use strings or wires, you could attempt to glue the false teeth to your gums or remaining molars. Adhesives included tree sap, bitumen, honey, or, yes, boiled cow hooves, which created a sticky, gelatinous goop. Think medieval fixodent, but edible. Some people just used bread dough, chewed until it was sticky, and pressed into place. That worked for about 5 minutes. Then it either hardened or dissolved and you were back to gumming your mutton stew like a baby bird. And here's the kicker, they didn't actually help with chewing. False teeth were, for the most part, cosmetic. The moment you tried to bite into anything denser than boiled peas, they shifted. Sometimes they fell out. Occasionally, they broke in half, wedging pieces of cow molar into your windpipe. Delightful. Rich nobles might own multiple sets. One for daily wear. One for ceremonies. One for seduction. Because nothing says romance like flashing a smile made of whalebone and battlefield leftovers. Now, just for fun, let's revisit the class divide. Poor people didn't get false teeth. They just lost their teeth and adapted. This meant a lot of mashing food, drinking pottage, and slurping gruel. Their mouths collapsed inward with age, giving that sunken look we now associate with tragic Victorian portraits and elderly peasants in Flemish paintings. They were mocked, laughed at, sometimes feared. But they were probably better off. Because at least their mouths weren't packed with rotting ivory and recycled canine incisors tied together with horsehair. Now, let's do a quick sensory check. It's the year 1347. You're at a noble's banquet. The room smells of roasted meat, wine, sweat, and poorly concealed sewage. A bishop lifts his cup, smiles. His teeth gleam like polished marble. Then one of them shifts. You hear a click. He excuses himself to adjust the wire anchoring his third premolar, which has been rubbing raw against his inner cheek. When he returns, he's bleeding slightly, but still smiling. Because aesthetics are important, even when you're digesting your own dental mistakes. And finally, let's not forget the moral panic. Some religious authorities disapproved of false teeth. They saw them as vanity, or worse, deception. You were pretending to be whole, pretending to be young, pretending to be alive when your own mouth had declared bankruptcy. Some even believed that dying with false teeth could confuse your soul's journey in the afterlife, that the angels might not recognize you. So in some regions, people had their dentures removed on their deathbed, lest St. Peter mistake them for a dental imposter. Which brings us back to you. You've lost 3 teeth. Your local charlatan has offered you a new smile, made from high-quality materials, which turn out to be goat molars polished with urine. He strings them together with thread, hands them to you with pride, and says, "Try not to eat anything." You smile. Your mouth clicks. Your gums sting. The teeth don't match. One is too long. Another is yellowed. But you look wholish again. And in the medieval world, that's enough. Now, lie back. Let your jaw relax. Feel your fake teeth press awkwardly into your gums. Tomorrow, we explore tooth pain remedies that were somehow worse than the disease, including smoking herbs through your nostrils, stuffing your gums with frog hearts, and whispering to a skull. You know, science. But for now, drift off. Dream of ivory canines and gesture-assisted molar extractions. You've earned it. You wake up with pain. Again. It's not emotional this time, though let's be honest, you've had better mornings. No, this is physical. And specific. A hot, pulsing, stabbing sensation in your jaw that feels like a tiny demon is tap dancing on your molar with a rusty fork. Congratulations. You have a toothache in the year 1325. And you are so not ready. Let's clarify something right away. In the medieval world, a toothache isn't just a minor inconvenience. It's not something you fix with a Tylenol and a dentist appointment. It's a biblical event. A punishment from God. A social embarrassment. Possibly even demonic possession. Because when you live in an era where no one understands infection, the moment your tooth decides to revolt, things get apocalyptic. So let's go on a journey, you and I. You, with your mouth full of rot and regret. Me, your helpful narrator, who has the benefit of hindsight and a fully functioning dental plan. Together, we'll explore what it actually meant to have a toothache in the Middle Ages. But before we apply any frog hearts or drill your skull open for fun, take a moment, seriously, and gently click the like button if your fingers still work. Subscribe if this beautiful horror show helps you sleep, and tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from and what hour of the night this nonsense found you. I read them all, while brushing my teeth, twice a day, with fluoride, like a coward. Right. Let's start with the pain. There are 2 things you need to understand about medieval dental pain. First, it never stops. Second, they had no idea what caused it. Well, okay, that's not entirely fair. Some medieval physicians had theories. Theories which were, of course, spectacularly wrong. The most popular explanation? Toothworms. Yes. Tiny, invisible worms that lived inside your teeth and gnawed their way through the enamel like freeloaders at an all-you-can-eat buffet. They were blamed for cavities, swelling, and pain. No one had actually seen one of these worms, of course, but absence of evidence has never been a problem for medieval medicine. Some doctors even described the worms in detail. They were said to be black or gray, wriggly, and curled up inside the hollow parts of the tooth like little parasites of sorrow. It wasn't until the 18th century that people finally let go of this charming fantasy. But back in the medieval period, tooth worms were gospel. So naturally, the first step in treating a toothache was to get rid of the worm. Now, before you assume they had some rational plan, like, say, lancing the area or prescribing antibiotics, which didn't exist yet anyway, let's talk about what they actually did. One option was fumigation. This involved heating herbs, resins, or crushed animal droppings over a flame, then channeling the smoke directly into your mouth. The idea was to smoke out the toothworm, as if your gums were a cursed beehive. Popular herbs included henbane, belladonna, and mandrake, all of which are, by the way, extremely toxic. So you, lying there in agony, would be ordered to inhale smoke through a horn or funnel while a priest muttered prayers. Your gums burned, your lungs filled with bitter fumes, your eyes watered, and the worm, shockingly, never came out. But on the bright side, you were too high to feel your face for a while. Another popular remedy was placing strange objects in your mouth. Some healers prescribed placing a mixture of burnt bread, boar fat, and ashes on the infected tooth. Others recommended chewing on garlic soaked in honey or rubbing your gums with the brains of a hare. You could also press live leeches to your jawline and hope they'd suck the pain out. One particularly innovative method involved stuffing your mouth with a mixture of dried mouse entrails and crushed mint. The mint was for flavor. The mouse, presumably, was for vibes. If that didn't work, you could try something even more unsettling, drilling a hole in your skull. No, really. This is not a joke. In severe cases, where the pain was assumed to be caused by trapped evil spirits or imbalanced humors in the head, the treatment of choice was trepanation. This means literally boring a hole into your skull with a hand-crank drill or sharpened bone to release the pressure. It was mostly done on people with headaches or seizures, but if your toothache caused facial swelling or hallucinations, both possible, some ambitious barber surgeon might offer to trepan you just a little. Because nothing soothes dental pain like an unsterilized hole in your cranium. Speaking of barber surgeons, let's talk about who actually treated you. There were no dentists. Not in the modern sense. Tooth care was handled by whoever happened to own a sharp enough blade and a high tolerance for screaming. This included barbers, monks, blacksmiths, butchers, your neighbor's cousin who once fixed a chicken's leg. Tooth pulling was done manually, often with metal forceps, pliers, or fingers wrapped in cloth. No anesthesia. No numbing. Just grip, twist, and yank, while 3 men held you down and you screamed into a wooden spoon. If the tooth broke mid-extraction, well, that was your problem. And by your, I mean your slowly rotting jaws. Sometimes, instead of pulling the tooth, they opted to burn it. Cauterization was used to kill the worm and close the channel of pain. A red-hot iron rod would be inserted into your mouth and held to the gum until it hissed. The smell, they said, was like roasting fat. Comforting. Other remedies included prayers to Saint Apollonia, the patron saint of toothaches, because she was tortured by having her teeth pulled out one by one. Relatable. Tying herbs around your neck, because somehow mint on your collar could soothe the rot in your gums. Biting a dead man's finger, which was believed to distract the pain, probably by traumatizing you into forgetting you had a mouth. Of course, there were also the magic spells. These often involved whispering charms into a skull or writing Latin phrases on a parchment, rolling it up, and shoving it in your mouth. Why? Because nothing says advanced medicine like flossing with ancient papyrus. And yet, despite all of this, people survived. Not everyone, obviously. Infections from tooth decay often led to sepsis, brain abscesses, or death by swelling throat. Some people choked on their own inflammation. Others died from blood poisoning after a bad extraction. And many, simply lived in chronic pain until their bodies gave up. It was miserable. But here's the thing. Some people got lucky. Their toothache faded on its own. The inflammation reduced. The pain disappeared. Maybe the nerve died. Maybe the infection drained. Maybe the gods had mercy. Who knows? But when this happened, it was considered a miracle. A sign of divine intervention. Pilgrimages were made, offerings given, and the person would live on, with half a jaw, missing teeth, and the unshakable belief that Saint Apollonia personally kissed their molars back to health. Let's take a moment to appreciate that. You, lying there in the pitch dark, your mouth sore, your head pounding, the vague taste of burnt mint and mouse bile still clinging to your tongue, realize something. You are still alive. You still have most of your teeth. And no one, so far, has suggested drilling a hole in your skull. Count your blessings. Now close your eyes. Let the soft hum of medieval superstition lull you to sleep.